Last week, I had you guys embark on some uh, more documentary style photography in which I challenged you guys to shadow some people close to you and begin to photograph portraits in a more or less a documentary mode. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And of course, you'll be reading about that in this module. But in this slideshow today, Days in the Life documentary photography, we're going to talk mostly about just the different ways you can approach documentary photography, and we're going to do that by looking at some different bodies of work by different artists that think about documentary in different ways, different approaches. And before we do that, I want to just introduce some simple concepts that will maybe help you uh, feel more comfortable and get more into the groove of being a documentary photographer. In some simple terms. It's not as complicated as maybe it sounds like, and it's certainly not just limited to photographing large socio-political events or global news like war or things like that. Documentary is much more broad and much more accessible than that. And I want us to keep that in mind. Because really, a documentary is quite simply telling real stories about real life with real pictures. That's it. And I think that that's really important to remember that documentary photography is simply making photographs about any topic that you wish that's real, whether that's something personal to you, whether that's something very large and global in scope. It doesn't matter. It just has to be a real topic or a real idea that has real life consequences. And everything else in between, the peoples, places, things, relationships, the symbolism, the moments, everything in between all of that is really where the beauty and style and uh, you know the talent in documentary photography lies. But documentary photography itself is simply just telling real stories with real pictures, right? Not being a director, not being a special effects person, not editing photographs in such a way that you are fictitiously making images, but you're just telling real stories. And that doesn't mean that you can't do it beautifully, that with you can't include drama, that you cannot have a directorial eye, but really just remember that you are trying to be honest in telling real stories about real things. That being said, there's a few things to remember when photographing a documentary series that might help you make a stronger, more cohesive, and visually stunning series. So the first thing that we want to start with, after of course choosing a topic, is scene setting. Um, when you talk about scene setting, that can mean a lot of different things, but in general, whatever type of documentary or story you're trying to tell, it has to really generally take place somewhere. And so scene setting images, I think, are really important because they really reveal where we are, illustrate the environment or the environmental mood, or establish a location or spatial relationship for a photo series. That could mean landscape shots, interiors, in a room. Really, it's just wide shots that really set a scene and tell us where the story is taking place. It could be more than one place, right? If you're doing a documentary on America, then scene setting shots will look very different throughout the series. But regardless, you need some shots that kind of establish where we are. Details are extremely important and often go, I think, overlooked when we start to think about what makes a good documentary. But details are so important because there are those little things that can carry lots of symbolism, that can carry lots of supplemental information, that are sort of tiny, and without them, our story starts to feel empty and falls apart. They're the glue that holds everything together. So when we think about details, think of images that focus in on specific information, that add to the larger narrative, add to this series. Often these images are cropped in tight, but not necessarily, and they might not necessarily contain a whole story within themselves, but are nonetheless important in context with other pictures or ideas within a series. So you'll see a lot of images of hands or cropped images that are really cropped tight, maybe relevant objects to the story, surfaces, even things like moments or sort of passive scenes in a photo series might be considered details. They're things that sort of link really important images to other important images. And here we have an image from a former student, Angelo Zambrano, from his series Forgetting to Remember the Pain, in which he photographed his grandmother in the early and middle stages of dementia. And she's, of course, a lover of family and a lover of classic American beer. Decisive and action moments. We talked a little bit about decisive moment earlier in this class in terms of elements and principles. And in documentary, it's also considered a very strong element. Decisive and action moments or action shots are images that capture important and often spontaneous or fleeting ephemeral events, instances or happenings that illustrate relevant themes, moods, relationships, or emotions. So, we think of these sort of iconic, decisive moments like, a bomb going off or this kiss happening in the streets. And these are good examples, but, they can be other types of action shots. Someone giving you a glance across the room where they just looked at the camera for a split second and really connected with the viewer. Or here in this scene where one of my students, Marcus, documented a week or two fishing with magnets, which is kind of a weird hobby that he does with his father, where they take large magnets and drift them through bodies of water. And who knows what they turn up. And here, this classic moment where they're tossing the magnet up into the air before it hits the water. Portraits are a topic in photography that are definitely their own genre, and when we think of portraiture as a genre, it's very different from portraiture in documentary sometimes. Portraiture is often staged, controlled, very intentional, and a lot of times portraiture in documentary is not that. It's just simply images that depict important or relevant characters within your story or your series, or that are relevant to your topic that you're photographing. And these images don't necessarily have to fit the trope of like a head and shoulders, a shot with eye contact, or even a view of the whole person. A portrait of someone could just be their hands and some important objects. However, generally in documentary, they do reveal specific visual information and oftentimes conceptual information about the relevant characters and how they connect to the greater theme or the story. And so portraits are a very important part of documentary, and by portraits I don't really necessarily always mean people either. I mean, if you're doing a documentary series on perhaps animals or an inanimate object, whatever that main character or focus is, there need to be some images that really establish that character as a focal point and as a character that plays an important role in the series. And that's what I sort of mean by portraits. And here we have an image of a man sitting next to some pills at night before he's going to bed, from my student Roy Sims in his series The Moment of Concern, which deals with physical health, mental health, and day-to-day life. Someone with a heart transplant. Perspective and point of view, again, another element that we sort of discussed in our elements and principles section earlier in this class. But perspective and point of view are these kinds of things that we're probably very familiar with from a cinematic viewpoint, right? Where we sort of establish a first or second or third person perspective. When we think about this in terms of documentary, where your lens is and how you sort of force a specific view of something onto us viewers, that can really change how that image feels or how the whole series feels. And so when we think about perspective and point of view, we're really thinking about the kinds of images that use specific camera angles or positions of the camera to force a certain sense of scale onto the viewer, or maybe to force a certain viewpoint on the viewer, like in this image that my student Zach Colucci made, where we feel very first person. The hand is being sort of lifted into this beam of light, and we sort of feel like we are that person in a way. So that sort of first-person perspective that was very intentional in putting the camera behind this person's hand. And so you can think of those kinds of images as intentionally getting really, really high or really, really low viewpoints, and also images that feel very, first or third person perspective. Regardless, if you're forcing some kind of specific view or specific point of view upon your viewer, that's the sort of thing that I'm referring to here. Mood and context setting. These kinds of images can often embody the previous images that we just talked about, but I think it's important to mention mood and context setting because a lot of images can sort of do similar things in different ways or say certain things in different ways. But mood and context setting images are really important within a series, kind of like details. They link everything together. Mood and context setting images really distill that emotional or psychological quality or feel within a series. And these are really important because they make the images feel cohesive, or they make the underlying idea or subject or theme come across in the images. And so when we're trying to provide that kind of mood or feel, or provide maybe important supplemental information, right? That's what I mean when I say context. When we're sort of providing those different kinds of informations through the images, that's what I mean by mood and context setting. And oftentimes, that's achieved by combining a lot of different things into one image, right? Utilizing formal elements to highlight something, implementing visual symbolism, right? To sort of use those formal elements as well as sort of conceptual ideas within the context of the image, in order to set an overall tone, emotion, or further, the understanding that the viewer has about the story that you're trying to thread together. I think this is a really great image to sort of explain that, because here my student Katie Dunworth was doing a documentary on how there's this sort of hollowness in identity in contemporary youth and teen life because of how we sort of define ourselves through this distant medium of the internet and through our phones and through screens, and we sort of are left on one side of them alone. Oftentimes sort of reaching out to try to connect to each other through a lit screen in the middle of the night, sort of lacking that warm human interaction, and left, sort of leaving an emptiness. That was sort of her idea behind these images, and I think that the formal elements that she's using in terms of the emptiness in the room and the darkness and her being lit by this screen, that's a very visceral aesthetic choice that really reveals a more conceptual feeling in the image. And so that's a mood and context setting image. And a lot of the images in her series were mood and context setting, but this one was particularly strong. So now I want to switch over to some more well-known artists that produced well-known bodies of work that are sort of documentary in nature, and use those bodies of work to really discuss different approaches and different visual styles in terms of documentary photography. When I think of documentary as a still photographic art, and I say that as in it's not a documentary film, Robert Frank is someone that sort of pops up into my mind in terms of bridging the gap between fine art photography and documentary. He's very, very famous for this series that he did called The Americans. And Robert Frank was born in Europe, and after World War II, wanted to really document what it meant to be American and to live in a post-war America that led this sort of victory in World War II, and was such a place of social and racial and cultural diversity. So he's very interested in that concept of America and what it means to be American. And eventually he would go on to make a book with these photographs, but it took him a very long time. He spent many, many months in America trying to get as many images as he could to edit down from to distill really this sort of feeling. And he really wanted to document the daily life and goings on of different kinds of Americans, but also the tone of American life and the tone of the American ideal, right? The freedom of identity, the sort of, sometimes rage and arrogance and power that, was perceived as undoubtedly American. There was a lot going on in America at the time. The civil rights movement, the division of races and cultures in this country, the division of wealth in the country. And there were very specific regions, and still are in America, that looked very different. And he sought to really photograph that throughout the country. And you can see that these images are sort of very honest images, not really overly artistic. They're just honest, sort of from the hip views of the day-to-day goings on in America at the time. But editing down from the many thousands of pictures on hundreds and hundreds of rolls of film that he took, he narrowed it down to less than 60 photographs, ultimately, that would become the book. And he had to pick very carefully the kinds of images and how they related to one another, and the kinds of symbols that were, sort of understood in those photographs. This is one of my favorites. When I look at this picture, I see a lot of different things. I see this dichotomy, though, between this sort of isolation and paranoia of these people kind of cooped up in their apartments looking out their windows. And then you juxtapose that with this sort of outgoing, strong, diverse, and free ideal that is represented by the stars and stripes of the American flag. And I find this image to be a very interesting dichotomy in that sort of symbolism that exists in it. A woman whose career sort of always bridged the gap between fine art and true reportage, and I see reportage as like, as like news photography, as documenting real stories of things that are happening around the world, is Susan Meiselas. And she has photographed political unrest in South and Central America. She's done portraits of sex workers in the United States. But my favorite series that she did was actually not for any news corporation or anything like that. It was actually just a project that she did on her own in collaboration with a group of young girls in her hometown in New York City, in Prince Street. And these girls were mostly Italian American girls, so young immigrants or children of immigrants. And they were just neighbors of hers that would heckle her on the street and were just sort of part of Susan Meiselas' local world, not even, the far-flung news stories that she was going to photograph when she wasn't home. And these girls represented, a very unique part of Meiselas' landscape and social sphere. And so she began to work up a rapport with them and would discuss things with them, talk with them, converse with them. And slowly she began to just hang out with them and photograph them. And what resulted was many years of photographs and, more importantly, a relationship between the photographer and her subjects, in which what was revealed was this beautiful vignette of what it's like to be young, what it's like to grow up, what it's like to change from a young person into an adult, what it's like to be a woman, and what it's like to be a young person in a city. And I think what's important to recognize about these photographs is how honest and comfortable they are, and how almost invisible the photographer is. It's as though another one of the girls was making these pictures. And that speaks to sort of the trust and the rapport and the insiderness that must be gained between a photographer and their subject sometimes if they are to capture truly honest photographs. Another thing that I love about these pictures of the Prince Street girls is that they're so diverse in the types of photographs. She wasn't just photographing the girls sort of standing against a wall at age 12, 16, 22. You know, she's photographing tender moments, she's photographing portraits, she's photographing these beautiful scene setting shots like this that sort of show the change in season, the intensely urban landscape that these girls grew up in. These tender moments like this. There's objects that provide such deep and meaningful emotional context that actually bring in the photographer herself, right? This is a letter from a couple of the girls that was written to Susan. So you really, it reveals um, the weight and the reality of that relationship. And also the trust that was built up between them. Because, of course, this documentary was sort of built over years between these girls growing up and Susan. And Susan always did a good job of really setting herself up for good photographs. You know, being in the right place at the right time, having the lens up and ready for special moments, for situations like this, and where her subject was being sort of beautifully framed. You know, in this scene here, this one of the young girls being framed by the other girls in the foreground in the subway. And again, going back to those mood setting and context setting informations. I love this photograph because, you know, in the background you have this sort of innocent location of the beach and this sort of young girl drawing in the sand, representing really, you know, this ideal of youth and innocence. And then in the foreground on the left, you have these two adolescent girls, you know, sort of, you know, growing up and maybe misbehaving a little bit, smoking cigarettes, you know, making very adult decisions, right in the face of this whole idea of youth, and I think it's a really great image. Again, like that image of the American flag in the windows by Robert Frank, there's a duality and a dichotomy in this image. At the beginning of this slideshow, I sort of jokingly stated that there was sort of an idiot's guide to documentary, and that was picking a topic, photographing the people, places, and things associated with that topic, and, you know, trying to edit down to reveal the symbolism and special moments in between those things. I think that Alex Soth is someone that does that really well. Alec is an American photographer and really became famous for his first series that eventually became a book and that launched his career. It's titled Sleeping on the Mississippi, and it is a photographic sort of exploration of what it is to be, you know, sort of a middle class American and how the middle class American landscape, especially along the Rio Grande, or excuse me, the Mississippi River Valley, what that really looks like. He was very fascinated by sort of middle America and all the things that took place there and what reality looked like for people that lived and worked there. And so Alec works with a large format camera, which takes film. So it's very slow, hard to set up, one shot at a time. It's not from the hip like Meiselas's photographs were. And so every shot is very carefully thought out and chosen with great care and very methodical ultimately. And so when I say something like photograph the people, places, and things, and then edit down to connect them with special moments and symbolism, Alec is the person that does that. He really does isolate the kinds of photographs that all together add up to something that is greater than the sum of their parts, right? There's this sort of spirit, this idea that is kind of semi-present in all the photographs, and when you see them as a group, they speak to this thing that he wants you to see and feel. And in this case, that is what real life looks like in middle America, in the Midwest, in the South, for real people across, you know, different backgrounds, upbringings, professions. And by photographing all of that, he chooses certain images very carefully in order to reveal some kind of symbolism within that reality, and ultimately brings you to a place of understanding by looking at those pictures. I love this photograph because it sort of pins, this ideal of mm, faith um, and sin together into one image in a landscape and in a portrait. And it's just such a strong image that's so complex in its meaning and yet so simple in its capturing. Alec loves portraits. He loves environmental portraits. They're very important to his series. I really think that when you look at his photographs, if you really to describe them in the most simple terms, they really are pictures of people, pictures of places, pictures of things, and somewhere within those images, he reveals something very special and very human, and very strange sometimes. I find this image to be really hilarious. I'm sure that her hair is very flammable, and I love this picture of her holding this other picture. I have no context for this image other than my own memories and associations with perhaps someone like my grandmother or one of my friend's parents showing me some relic from their family or something that they're proud of. Um, I just find it to be such a strange and interesting portrait. I encourage you to look at Alex Soth's other projects. He's got many. He's very much into bookmaking. That is his preferred method of presenting images is in books, and so sequence and edits are very important to him. So please go and take a look at him. He's one of the artists in this week's Artist Spotlight, so you'll be watching a video about his work and hearing him talk a little bit about making photographs. So I hope that you follow up on that. Someone who I think makes sort of similar photographs to Alec, but does it in a sort of more boiled down and uh, intimate way, is a local artist and a good friend of mine, actually, Saya Bowen. You guys actually might know him if you're locals here in Albuquerque as well. He owns a restaurant called Magokuro. It's a Japanese restaurant and really great food. I would encourage you to go check it out. He's a man of many talents, but spent a majority of his life studying photography. And in his series Nadachi, he explores this relationship between uh, the landscape of his family's uh, hometown in Japan and sort of the psychological loss that happens when a town starts to die, young people leave, and um, all that's left is this aging landscape that has been sort of slowly begun to be forgotten because people are leaving for bigger and better opportunities in bigger cities. And that's in a large part what this series is about. And that's sort of Seiya exploring a town that is losing its youth and therefore losing its lifeblood to other places. But the photographs that he makes are very contextual to that idea, but in themselves become very psychological, and they require a lot of symbolism uh, in order to really connect back to the main focus of the series. So take an image like this, right? There's sort of a broken bucket, empty, one little tiny flower left. It sort of symbolically calls back to that idea of a thing becoming emptied out and all the life sort of leaving it. And you'll see that theme pop up again and again in his photographs throughout the series, whether it's realistic portraits like this of just the aging workforce in the town, where folks that would regularly be retired uh, and on, pension or retirement or, you know, things like that are still working and doing hard labor because there's no young people anymore. Uh, you know, one thing that's really special about these photographs is that they're very intimate because it's a personal story to say and his family. So we get to see, the insides of houses. We get to see tender moments and quiet corners. And there's often a lot of calls back to this idea of youth and the lack thereof, and this sort of loose undertone of life and death because he's sort of dealing with the life and death of this town. Um, People are born in this town, the people leave the town, and then the town is sort of left to crumble. And so, an image like this, maybe perhaps a simple kind of disturbing picture of a dead snake on the road in the town, carries a lot of weight and symbolism with it because of its context with the greater point of this series. And this is also an important moment to maybe mention that larger theme that is to be understood within these smaller contextual images might be best conveyed through a short artist statement in order to place us in a headspace to understand why an image like this exists within the series. For me, this image is very important to the series, and I really, really love it. And um, I'll, I'll explain it a little bit to you that these two pillars that you see on either side of the image are beams and trusses that support the new high-speed subway rail, the new high-speed trains that had recently been built in the few years before this in order to connect this town to other bigger cities in the region and in the country of Japan overall. In a country that's very technologically advanced and very interconnected through transportation. Um, this town that used to sort of be more isolated was now, a short, quick train ride away to bigger cities. And so, as people leave the town for bigger and better things, it's left to sort of wither away. And I think that this image is such a strong thesis for that series and that idea, because here you have, in this case, his mother representing perhaps one of the older individuals in this community, sitting on a swing set, sort of this representation of youth and childhood and innocence being shadowed and really kind of dwarfed by these giant subway beams that are the very symbol and source of the town's decay. So I find this image to really be a powerful summation of those ideas in the series. And so when you're making a documentary series that you want to be powerful, think of what it is that you're really trying to say with your story, what your story is really about, what the images are really about, and see if you can say that in one sentence, and then see if you can sum that up in one photograph. That's a really challenging thing to do, and I think that this picture really does that. The last artist we're going to talk about today is someone who I actually got the chance to communicate with during a photographic exhibition I helped put together, and that is Christine Collins. And I really loved her photo series called The Keepers, because it was kind of surreal, but also really, really normal and accessible at the same time. It's a series about beekeepers, specifically beekeepers that keep small groups of bees, hives of bees in sort of residential and suburban neighborhoods. Beekeeping is sort of mystical, and if you look at it and the tools and the things that go into beekeeping, it is very mystical and it's very ancient in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, it's very technical and very modern. And you know, but it's also something that can be done in an everyday context. And it's just such a bizarre pastime and such a bizarre hobby, but it's also something that is very integral to human life at a large scale. And so really taking something like an idea like beekeeping that is something that we all understand happens, but really don't have any, visual or personal experience with very often. This series is so bizarre in its intimacy with something that seems kind of strange when you really think about it. Our relationship with keeping groups of insects for the purposes of maybe enjoyment, meditation, or perhaps the consumption of their product, honey. But she makes these images that feel so quiet. If there is a tone that I can really express or relate to this series, it's this quiet. All the images are fairly similar in color and tone, with these pale whites, soft yellows, and maybe spring and fall greens. We have these really beautiful, bizarre details like this. Scene setting shots where we realize that we're not in some strange commercial beehive, but really we're just in someone's backyard, perhaps in the Northeast or in the Midwest. And we really get a feel for the act of doing something like beekeeping, right? Putting on a strange suit, using steam to subdue insects, and just digging into these boxes full of beehives out in the grass. I really loved it because it felt all of a sudden like it was so normal and accessible. And I wonder now if there's something that I couldn't photograph that's kind of strange and interesting and intriguing that's happening maybe in my neighbor's house or backyard. And she has a really great variety of images and really wonderful moments, and really drives home the sort of family aspect of these people that keep beehives here, obviously, including the family and beekeeping, sort of educating the youth. And a really nice detail. So I really do hope that these different artists approaching documentary in different ways, some people being very in the moment, immersed in it, like Susan Meiselas and Robert Frank kind of shooting from the hip, these quick snapshots. People like Alex Soth and Saya Bowen setting up methodical images that are rife with symbolism. And sort of more poetic approaches like, Christine Collins here, sort of making these almost haiku-like photographs that are so simple and beautiful and relatable in their, in their exotic subject matter. I hope that some of the tips in thinking about the different kinds of images that you should make in order to create a good dynamic photo series that can be linked together in the beginning of this slideshow is helpful. And if you have any questions about any of this, or you'd like to talk any of it over, or if something wasn't clear, shoot me an email, shoot me a text. We can hop on video chat or do whatever and talk about it. And I wish you the best of luck with your documentary. I'm so very excited to see what you guys pick and what you all produce image-wise. And please do get through the reading by Charlotte Cotton on Moments in History, her chapter from her book Photography as Contemporary Art, in which she talks about documentary photography in different ways. And also take a look at the artist spotlight, because there are some really great photographers in there that I really want you to get to know, including two from this slideshow. Okay, so that's it. Hope you get through this long module. You got a few weeks to go, so you got some time, so try not to freak out, and good luck. Thanks.